So this is video 11.2. I'm going to start with a little review of 11.1, and then we'll get into all the rest of the stuff that's in the chapter. 11.2 begins with pesticides on page 292. But first, a little bit of a review. And here is that review. We were talking about different things that happen along the lines with Green Revolution. And please remember, Green Revolution sounds like it's a great environmental thing, but it's only referring to the fantastic job we've done to mechanize farming. But as a result of that, we have a lot of environmental issues. So the Green Revolution in totality is really not very good for the environment. And I listed these things for you just as a reminder. Mechanization, and the fact that during the Green Revolution we had a tremendous increase in these large farming machines that really cut down on the requirement for manpower. We talked about irrigation problems. Please remember the solution to irrigation problems: drip irrigation. Spent some time discussing fertilizers, organic and inorganic, and it is the synthetic or inorganic fertilizers that are the problem. And the last thing I ended with in 11.1 was a discussion of monocropping. So here is number 5, and again, this begins on page 292. I could probably spend a whole class period talking to you about pesticides. The old textbook that I used to use had a whole chapter on pesticides, and this textbook only has a little bit of discussion, but I'm going to make sure that we cover it completely. So let's start with some definitions like we usually do. You know that side at the end of anything means death, right? Homicide, suicide. And so when you see side at the end, you know it's got something to do with the death. And then we look at the first part and we have something like insecticides, kill insects. Herbicides kill weeds, kill plants. There's an interesting story about herbicides and the herbicide called Roundup. You may be familiar with Roundup. It is a very powerful herbicide. In fact, if you squirt Roundup on your grass, it'll kill your grass. But if you want to kill some weeds that are growing up, for instance, through the crack of your concrete, spray this stuff on, it will kill it. Well, the company that designed Roundup, Monsanto, came up with a genetically modified seed that was resistant to Roundup. And they started to sell that seed. As a matter of fact, they patented that seed, and it became a well-known and used product with farmers. Because see how this works? They could spray Roundup on their fields. It would kill all of the plant life, but it wouldn't kill their crop because their crop was genetically modified to be resistant to Roundup. And that has raised some major problems in the agriculture community. I have a video to show you about that. Rodenticide obviously kills rodents, mice and rats and stuff like that. And fungicide kills fungi. There are some very important terms and definitions that you need to know when it comes to pesticides for the ACE exam and the AP exams. The first is the difference between these two. A broad spectrum pesticide kills a wide variety of pests. A selective pesticide is designed to kill one pest and only one pest, or one weed and only one weed. So different pesticides are used for different reasons. Obviously, if you're a farmer, you want to kill as many different things that are bothering your crops as possible, and you'll try to get a broad spectrum pesticide. One of the problems with pesticides, because they are man-made, they're made in a chemical factory of some sort, is the idea of persistence. Please circle this word, underline it, put a star next to it. persistence is a very important concept in environmental science because these chemicals are made in a factory. They do not break down in nature naturally. So they persist in nature way after they do the job that we were trying to get them to do. So for instance, Farmer Jones sprays his crops. That's fine. He kills the pests that are bothering his crops. But that chemical doesn't just go away. It is still sitting in the ground, and therefore it can certainly run off during the rainy season, or especially after all of the crops have been cultivated. These chemicals last for decades in the environment, in nature. That's the concept of persistence. And I know that there are chemical companies that are working to make pesticides that have no persistence. They do not. They break down in nature. They do not stick around for long periods of time. But we're not there yet. So persistence is the ability of these chemicals to remain in nature decade after decade. Let's talk about DDT. I think I've already told you the story of DDT before. Here's the deal. This was one of the best pesticides ever made. Farmers loved it. I mean, people used it around the house. It got rid of just about any pest you were thinking about, whether it be a big rodent or whether it be a tiny mite or it might be ants. DDT killed a wide variety of organisms. And then we discovered a problem with DDT. Unlike all these other chemicals that are still persistent, DDT is not only persistent, it is that, it stays in nature for a long time, but it also causes something called bioaccumulation. Bioaccumulation is the buildup of a chemical in organism tissues. And as we go up the food chain, we discover that more and more of the chemical is present in organisms as we go up there. For instance, DDT was famous for this example. It was discovered that ospreys and other birds of prey were declining in numbers. And it took scientists years first to recognize that this was the problem, but then another decade to figure out what was causing the problem. And they finally isolated the problem. What was happening was DDT was being sprayed in farms. The persistent nature of DDT meant it ended up in waterways, in lakes and rivers. And it wasn't killing the fish, but it was accumulating in the fish tissue. So now the ospreys and other birds of prey swoop down, eat the fish, and this chemical, instead of it decreasing as you go up the food chain, much like the energy available does, the amount of DDT actually accumulated, that's where we get the word accumulated, in the tissue of the top predators. Now, what was this causing for the birds of prey? It was causing the females to lay eggs whose shell was too thin. And so the babies weren't living long enough. They were laying their normal number of eggs, but an inordinately high number of babies were dying before they ever hatched because those eggshells were too thin. This story, you can tell it must have taken a very long time for scientists to figure it out, but this is the story of bioaccumulation. Please remember it because it's very, very important. DDT is the chemical to remember when you hear people talk about bioaccumulation. All right, this diagram that you have in your book on page 293 and I have here shows you the idea of resistance. And the resistance is just like all of the other genetics that we've talked about before. Farmer Jones sprays for some sort of bug. Most of the bugs die, but a few don't. You wonder why they don't. Well, it's because they have some kind of a mutated gene that gives them resistance to the pesticide. Well, if that resistance is indeed genetic, then these tiny organisms have millions of offspring, and they pass their genetic resistant gene to all of their offspring. And before you know it, Farmer Jones has organisms in his field that are resistant to the pesticide. The pesticide that worked so good for him last year won't work at all this year. Now he's got to find something new to spray to kill those organisms. The last important concept with pesticides is this thing called the pesticide treadmill. Here's the idea of the pesticide treadmill. Each year, it seems, Farmer Jones has to spray more and more to get the same result. Because of this resistance, perhaps, he sees more and more pests, so he begins to spray more and more. This is called the pesticide treadmill. It's just like he's running on a treadmill. He's not getting anywhere because each year he finds he has to spray a little bit more and a little bit more. The pesticide treadmill is an example of a positive feedback loop. You spray, you kill. Next year there's more of them. You spray, you kill. Next year there's more of them. You spray, you kill. You get the idea. They don't all die, and the problem is Farmer Jones has to use more and more chemical to kill the same number of organisms. And remember, this chemical is going to end up being persistent. It does not leave the ecosystem. Okay, that is the discussion of pesticides. We will move on now to on page 293 and talk a little bit about genetic engineering. You're probably aware that genetic engineering is quite a discussion in today's agriculture, mainly because people are very concerned about eating foods that have been genetically engineered. But you've got to realize something. Farmers are the great geneticists of our time. For hundreds of years, farmers have crossed certain plants that had a trait that they liked with another plant, same type of food. For instance, rice plant A and rice plant B. They're both rice, but they're different species of rice. A has a great characteristic of being resistant to most pests. B may have the characteristic of a higher yield. So you cross those two varieties and you form a super rice that has both traits. And of course, this is a lot of trial and error. It takes a lot of effort and hard work, planting a lot of seeds, a lot of seasons, year after year, to get that great trait that's found in all of your crops. But eventually, of course, you've got seeds and you'll have all of your crops with exactly the same genetic traits. So here are the benefits. If you've got a strain of a certain food product like corn and you get more ears of corn per stalk, that's a greater yield. And you're going to want to take the seeds from those plants and make sure that you use them again next year because you got a great yield. So you are sort of cooking into the genetic soup that particular trait of greater yield. Sometimes it results in greater food quality. The numbers of ears of corn that will be healthy and end up at the market may be way greater when we have this greater food quality. We have noticed that in some cases, as I mentioned a second ago, farmers notice that a certain strain of crop is resistant to pests. It may produce some chemical genetically that makes pests not interested in eating that plant. Well, you want to take that trait and you want to engineer it into the crops that you use in the future. Probably the most important thing about genetic engineering is our ability to increase food production as a result of genetic engineering. Our ability to create ever greater yields by the way we manage the genetics of our crops. And of course, no agribusiness would be complete without being concerned about profits. And of course, if you genetically engineer your crop, you are creating much greater profits. Here are the concerns about genetically modified organisms. They're called GMOs. You need to know that acronym. It's been used on both exams before, and they don't define it. So you need to know what GMOs are. The first thing we're very concerned about is safety for human consumption. Very concerned that us messing with nature in this way might ultimately cause some sort of harm to humans that we don't know, that we don't understand. You know, some people think that some of the characteristics that are in the human population today could very well exist because we've been genetically modifying foods. And to be honest with you guys, you're the first generation of children that have been brought up with genetically modified organisms since you were born. So as we watch your generation grow up and we check for signs and symptoms of certain diseases, it makes you wonder. For instance, there's more asthma in your generation than any other. Maybe we don't have this linkage yet, but maybe it has something to do with all of the different genetically modified foods that you've been subjected to in your life. You don't even realize it. Your parents don't even realize it. And that brings us to this third point here. Because we don't recognize, we don't even know that we're eating genetically modified foods. Hang on a second. Don't you just love my dogs? I just shut the door. Alright, so anyway, because the genetically modified organisms are not identified, we don't even know when we're eating them. And indeed, for all of the 80s and 90s, you did not know if what you were eating was really, really natural or if it was genetically modified. So there's been a big push towards labeling these organisms, these plants, this food that you're eating as genetically modified. And so there is a continued push to regulate the amount of genetically modified foods and at least to let consumers know when they are eating them. And of course that leads us to the craze. Well, craze isn't the right word, but you know what I mean. The popularity. There you go. It leads us to the popularity of all natural foods, of organic foods. These are foods that the farmer testifies that he has not tinkered with the seeds in any way. And by the way, that organic food popularity is partly because the farmer also promises to only use organic fertilizers, nothing inorganic. He promises not to use pesticides. He doesn't spray pesticides on these plants because they have that persistence that I mentioned before. Speaking of persistence, that's another thing you need to always remember. I'm sure your parents have taught you this, but when you go off to college, make sure any vegetables, fruits that you buy, that you wash off thoroughly before you eat them. Because of the great persistence that pesticides have in the environment, they can be right there on that head of lettuce that you're about to eat. And then you might wonder why you have a bout of stomach flu or something like that the next day. You'll chalk it up to having the flu, when in reality it might have been some trace amounts of those pesticides left on the food that you end up eating. And of course, we've talked about in earlier chapters how when we mess with genetic compositions, we can end up with a smaller gene pool. And a smaller gene pool means less biodiversity. And it means a less of an opportunity for that species to evolve naturally to whatever its future state might be. With us messing with the biodiversity, it decreases genetic diversity. Okay, I think the last thing I want to mention on GMOs is just we are talking, you should know that we are talking mostly about plants here. There are very few genetically modified animals that I can think of that are in the marketplace. There have been a number of requests. That's where the regulation comes in. Government is now at a point where they have to approve the use of genetically modified organisms, and I don't think there's been any approvals for animals, but there have been a number of requests. So farmers are producing genetically modified animals for our meat production. That's a good point to stop. We'll discuss the alternatives to industrial methods and then talk about all these other solutions. The last part of the chapter is about speaking particularly about meat and fish. So I'll end this video now because I know how much you want shortness in your videos. Talk to you later.